ruthless mind. There is a moment, usually at dusk, when the street lamps have just begun to hum their small electric prayers, when the city reveals its second face. The first face, the one sold to tourists and schoolchildren, is made of slogans and handshakes. The second face is older, thinner, and infinitely more honest. It is the face that does not care whether you are loved, only whether you are feared or useful. Most people spend their lives polishing the first face. A few learn to recognize the second and keep their gaze steady when it looks back. This is a story about the second face. It begins on a winter evening in a room that smells of old paper and candle smoke. A man, call him the archivist, sits at a long table whose surface is scarred by centuries of ink. Before him lies a single volume bound in cracked leather. The title has been effaced by time, but the contents have not. They are instructions for seeing what most people agree not to see. The archivist turns the pages slowly, as though each word is a trapdoor. When he finishes, he closes the book and looks up at the only other person in the room. "You were never meant to read this," he says. "That is why you must." I bits of ein. The first lesson is about sight, not the kind that measures color or distance, but the kind that recognizes the moment when a smile becomes a weapon. The archivist calls it reading the undertext. Most conversations, he explains, are two rivers flowing in parallel, the river of what is said and the river of what is meant. The first river sparkles and chatters. The second moves in silence, carrying the real cargo. Learning to navigate the second river is like learning to breathe underwater. Uncomfortable at first, then exhilarating, then simply the way things are. He demonstrates with a story. A merchant once approached a duke to ask for a loan. The duke listened politely, nodded at the appropriate moments, and at the end of the interview promised to consider the request. The merchant left satisfied. 3 days later, the loan was denied. The merchant was baffled. The interview had seemed cordial. What he had missed was the second river, the way the duke's fingers drummed only when the merchant mentioned repayment, the way the duke's eyes flicked to the window whenever the merchant spoke of his own cleverness. These were not gestures, they were verdicts. The merchant had mistaken courtesy for interest. He had drowned in the first river, while the second carried him away. Recess. The second lesson is about loyalty, which the archivist describes as the currency that inflates fastest and spends slowest. He places a coin on the table, old silver, worn smooth by countless palms. This, he says, is what loyalty looks like after it has changed hands too often. It retains its shape, but loses its weight. Loyalty, he explains, is rarely reciprocated in the same alloy. A man who gives pure gold often receives brass in return, and brass is only valuable when the giver believes it is gold. He tells of a knight who swore fealty to 3 lords in succession, each time believing his oath was eternal. The first lord rewarded him with land, the second with a title, the third with a funeral. The knight died believing himself faithful. The lords remembered him as convenient. The archivist's point is simple. Loyalty is not a virtue until it is tested, and by the time it is tested, it is often too late to withdraw it. The wise man, therefore, keeps a ledger. He gives loyalty the way a gardener gives water, sparingly to roots that have proven they can grow something worth keeping. IV. The third lesson is about reputation, which the archivist calls the shadow you cast in other people's dreams. Reputation is not what you are. It is what others believe you might become. A beggar in rags who walks as though he owns the street will be treated with more caution than a prince who apologizes for existing. The trick is to cultivate the shadow without becoming its prisoner. He illustrates with a game. Place 2 identical chess pieces on a board. Tell one observer that the first piece is a king who has lost his army. Tell the second observer that the second piece is a pawn who has killed a king. Ask them which piece is more dangerous. both will choose the pawn. The lesson: perception outweighs fact, and perception can be sculpted the way a sculptor shapes marble, by removing everything that is not essential. The essential in this case is mystery. A man who reveals everything becomes a book that has been read. A man who reveals nothing becomes a locked room whose contents are imagined to be priceless. The fourth lesson is about conflict, which the archivist describes as the weather system no one admits they control. Most people believe conflict is something that happens to them like rain. In truth, conflict is something they summon, postpone, or redirect. The difference between a storm and a breeze is often a matter of timing. He recounts the tale of a diplomat who prevented a war by arriving 3 days late to a negotiation. The delay was deliberate. During the interval, the would-be aggressor's allies grew impatient. The treasury began to empty, and the weather turned foul. By the time the diplomat appeared, the appetite for battle had been replaced by the appetite for supper. The treaty was signed over roasted lamb. The diplomat never explained the delay. Explanations would have transformed strategy into luck. The lesson: conflict is not avoided by appeasement, but by arranging the field so that the enemy's victory costs more than his defeat. The fifth lesson is about niceness, a vice the archivist calls the velvet glove that conceals the iron shackle. Niceness, he explains, is not kindness. It is the absence of edges. A knife without an edge cannot cut bread, but it also cannot cut rope. The man who is merely nice is useful only to those who require no cutting. He demonstrates with a portrait. In the portrait, a courtier bows low before a queen, his smile as polished as the marble floor. Behind him stands a guard whose face is unreadable. The courtier is beloved. The guard is feared. When the queen's favor shifts, the courtier is banished. The guard remains. The smile, once currency, becomes evidence of treachery. The unreadable face, once suspect, becomes proof of loyalty. The lesson: edges are not cruelty, they are definition. A man who defines himself by what he will not tolerate is less likely to be tolerated only when it is convenient. The sixth lesson is about preparation, which the archivist calls the art of arriving before the invitation is sent. Most people prepare for the future they expect. The wise prepare for the future they intend. The difference is subtle and absolute. He describes a general who trained his soldiers during peacetime by marching them through swamps at midnight, feeding them on roots, and making them sleep without blankets. When war came, the enemy believed the general's army would be softened by comfort. Instead, they discovered men who could march through mud without complaint, who could sleep on stone without waking, who could eat bark without grimacing. The enemy's surprise was not tactical, it was philosophical. They had prepared for soldiers. They encountered weather. The seventh lesson is about self-control, which the archivist describes as the only fortress that cannot be stormed from without. Self-control is not the absence of impulse. It is the presence of a longer view. A man who can delay gratification is a man who can trade the present for a future that has not yet been invented. He demonstrates with a clock. A clockmaker once built a device that ticked once every 100 years. The first tick was heard by a child, the second by an old man. Between ticks the world changed. Empires rose and fell, languages vanished, oceans swallowed cities. Yet the clock continued, indifferent to applause or lament. The lesson: time rewards patience the way a river rewards depth. A man who can wait without fidgeting is a man who can own the moment when it finally arrives. Annex. The eighth lesson is about speech, which the archivist calls the coin that buys silence. Words are not merely sounds, they are investments. Every sentence spent on explanation is a sentence not spent on observation. Every apology offered too freely is a confession offered too cheaply. He tells of a merchant who lost a fortune by explaining his prices. The more he justified, the more he revealed his desperation. Another merchant, asked why his goods cost more, replied only, "They are worth it." The first merchant went bankrupt. The second became legendary. The lesson, explanation, is a form of surrender. A man who speaks as though his worth is self-evident rarely needs to prove it. X. The ninth lesson is about presence, which the archivist describes as the gravity that bends attention without effort. Presence is not charisma, it is the absence of apology. A man who occupies space as though he belongs there will be granted more space than a man who asks permission to exist. He illustrates with a memory. A king once entered a hall where 100 nobles were arguing. He said nothing. He simply stood at the threshold and looked around. The argument faded, not because he commanded silence, but because silence became the only appropriate response to his arrival. The king had not raised his voice. He had raised the stakes. The lesson: authority is not granted, it is recognized. A man who behaves as though he is already in charge will often discover that he is XI. The 10th lesson is about scarcity, which the archivist calls the perfume that makes value intoxicating. Scarcity is not cruelty. It is the refusal to dilute essence. A man who is always available becomes a habit. A man who is rarely available becomes a ritual. He demonstrates with a feast. A host once invited guests to dine every night. The food was lavish, the company pleasant, yet attendance dwindled. Another host invited guests only when the moon was full. The food was simple, the company sparse, yet invitations were coveted like relics. The lesson: rarity creates reverence. A man who withholds himself teaches others to cherish what they are given. Extols. The 11th lesson is about choice, which the archivist describes as the only freedom that cannot be taken, only surrendered. Choice is not the absence of limits. It is the presence of discernment. A man who chooses his battles chooses his victories. He recounts the tale of a swordsman who fought every challenger. His skill was unmatched, but his reputation was that of a thug. Another swordsman fought only when honor demanded it. His skill was equal, but his reputation was that of a legend. The first man died exhausted. The second died remembered. The lesson: restraint is not weakness. It is the art of selecting the stage on which your strengths will be most clearly seen. XE. The 12th lesson is about legacy, which the archivist calls the echo that outlives the shout. Legacy is not what you leave behind, it is what continues to move forward when you are gone. He demonstrates with a garden. A gardener planted trees whose fruit he would never taste. When asked why, he replied that the shade would belong to children whose names he did not know. The trees grew tall, and the gardener's name was forgotten. But the shade remained, and in the shade stories were told that changed the world. The lesson: influence is not possession, it is propagation. A man who plants seeds whose fruit he will never eat has learned the final secret of power. It grows best when no one is watching it grow. 40. The archivist closes the book. The candle has burned low. The shadows have gathered like conspirators. He looks at the only other person in the room, me, and says nothing. The silence is not awkward. It is instructive. In that silence I understand that the lessons are not rules but lenses, not commandments but invitations. The city of 7 districts still stands. The storms still cross the lake. The clocks still tick once every 100 years. But now I see the second face of the city, and I know that the face is also a mirror. XV. I leave the room at dawn. The street lamps have gone quiet, and the city is beginning its daily performance of politeness. I walk through it differently now. I do not argue with the man who insists he is right. I observe the tremor in his voice. I do not explain my prices to the customer who hesitates. I let the hesitation ripen into decision. I do not seek to be loved by those who cannot love themselves. I seek instead to be useful to those who can. The lessons are not armor, they are bones. They do not protect me from the world. They hold me upright within it. XSDI. Years later I returned to the archivist's room. The table is still there. The candle has been replaced. The book is gone. In its place is a single chess piece, a pawn carved from black stone. On the base is inscribed a sentence: "The game begins when you stop asking for permission to play." I pick up the pawn and feel its weight. It is heavier than it looks. I understand now that the lessons were never about power over others. They were about power over the stories we tell ourselves. The man who masters his own narrative does not need to conquer the world. The world, sensing his certainty, steps aside. XV7. The city continues to build its first face. Billboards of smiles, headlines of harmony, promises of fairness. The second face continues to watch from the shadows, patient and unblinking. I walk between them now, carrying the pawn in my pocket like a compass. When I meet a man who believes the world is fair, I do not argue. I listen. When I meet a man who believes he is powerless, I do not lecture. I wait. When I meet a man who believes he is finished, I offer the pawn and the sentence. Some take it, some do not. The city does not notice. The second face does. It nods, ever so slightly, and the nod is approval enough. XV8. The final lesson is not spoken. It is lived. Every morning I wake and choose which face to wear. Some days I wear the first, smiling at strangers, nodding at platitudes, agreeing with the weather. Other days I wear the second, moving through the world like a blade that has learned to walk. The choice is mine, and that is the lesson. Power is not the absence of masks. It is the knowledge that the mask is a tool, and the hand beneath it is steady. XIX. The pawn remains in my pocket. It grows heavier each year, not with weight but with memory. I have given it away a dozen times, and each time it returns, carried by men who have learned to read the undertext, to navigate the second river, to plant trees whose shade they will never taste. The city continues to build its billboards, and the second face continues to watch. I no longer distinguish between them. They are the same face, seen from different heights. XX. The story ends where it began, in a room that smells of old paper and candle smoke. The book is gone, the archivist is gone, but the table remains, and on it now lies a single sentence carved into the wood. The world is not yours to conquer, it is yours to witness. I sit in the chair that was once his, and listen to the silence. It is not empty. It is full of footsteps that have not yet been taken, of choices that have not yet been made, of men who will one day find the pawn and understand that the game begins when they stop asking for permission to play. The silence is the only lesson left, and it is enough.